You probably know that countries rise and fall. Maps change. Names disappear. But what if I told you there are entire nations that once thrived, with flags, rulers, armies, and dreams, yet now they're nothing more than whispers in dusty books? These weren't just lines on a map. They were real places. Homes to millions. Stages for wars, revolutions, empires, and sometimes quiet ends. Today, we're unlocking the borders that time erased. Not through myths or legends, but through the strange, sobering truth of history itself. This is Forgotten Borders, a journey through 10 ancient countries that no longer exist, but whose shadows still shape the world you live in. And before we dive in, make sure you have your favorite drink and sit back, relax, and let's begin. The Republic of Texas, a lone star that burned bright. For nearly a decade, from 1836 to 1845, Texas wasn't just some rebellious territory. It was an independent republic. With its own government, military, flag, currency, and international diplomacy, Texas operated as a sovereign nation, forging a path between empires. Born from rebellion, baptized in blood, and carried by pure grit, the Republic of Texas remains one of the boldest and most misunderstood chapters in North American history. Their main activities: the hustle for survival. The economy of the Republic of Texas was held together by cotton, cattle, land, and ambition. Cotton farming became the cornerstone. Texas had fertile land and a growing enslaved labor force to match the southern U.S. economy. Cattle ranching was more than just cowboy imagery. It was a real economic driver, with longhorns roaming the open range. But here's where it gets wild. Land speculation was the real game. The Republic promised thousands of acres to attract settlers and veterans. Massive land grants were handed out, often overlapping or under dubious claims. Texas was basically giving away the future to buy loyalty and population growth. Trade existed, but it was fragile. Texas exported cotton to Europe and the U.S., but border instability and piracy on the Gulf made things chaotic. The Republic had no central bank, and its redback currency lost so much value it became practically worthless. People reverted to bartering or using U.S. dollars instead. Relationships: friends were few, enemies were many. Texas broke off from Mexico in bloody rebellion, and Mexico never recognized its independence. In fact, multiple Mexican governments vowed to reclaim it, launching raids and border conflicts well into the 1840s. The threat of full-scale war never went away. To protect itself, Texas went global. They actively sought recognition and alliances. The United States, France, Britain, Belgium, and even the Netherlands officially recognized the Republic. Embassies opened in Paris and London. But recognition wasn't the same as protection. None of these countries were willing to go to war with Mexico on Texas's behalf. The Republic also had violent, shifting relationships with Native American nations, especially the Comanche and Apache. Treaties were made and broken. Raids, counter-raids, and massacres defined this era. Some leaders, like Sam Houston, pushed for peace treaties. Others called for total military suppression. Internally, Texas was divided. Some wanted to stay independent forever. Others pushed hard for annexation by the U.S. There were even whispers of forming a slaveholding empire stretching into California or Cuba. The dream was big. But reality had other plans. Their rise and peak, a revolution, then a rush. It all began with revolution. By the early 1830s, Anglo settlers, many from the U.S., were flooding into Mexican-controlled Texas, often ignoring Mexican laws like the ban on slavery. Tensions exploded into open rebellion in 1835. The Battle of the Alamo became a legendary last stand, and weeks later, the Texans scored a shocking victory at the Battle of San Jacinto. They captured General Santa Anna himself, forcing him to sign a treaty recognizing Texas independence. On March 2, 1836, Texas declared itself a republic. It quickly formed a constitution, elected Sam Houston as president, and started laying the foundations of a real nation. They claimed not only modern Texas, but parts of what is now New Mexico, Colorado, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming, an ambitious border that wasn't exactly enforced. Militarily, Texas created an army and a small navy to protect its coast and challenge Mexican ships. They built a Congress, passed laws, and tried to behave like a legitimate state on the world stage. At its peak, the Republic had tens of thousands of settlers, bustling new towns like Houston and Austin, and a culture deeply tied to frontier survival. But that peak was also shaky, fueled by dreams, not stability. Their decline or fall, the cost of independence. Being independent came at a steep price. The Republic had constant debt, estimated at over $10 million by 1845, a massive sum at the time. The redback currency collapsed. Military skirmishes drained resources. Mexico continued to reject any peace, and with each passing year, the Republic looked more like a house of cards. By the early 1840s, many Texans believed their best shot at survival was joining the United States. The idea was popular, but complicated. The U.S. hesitated. It didn't want war with Mexico, and Texas's pro-slavery stance stirred political tension. Eventually, with support from President James K. Polk, the U.S. approved annexation. On December 29, 1845, Texas became the 28th U.S. state. Mexico, furious, saw this as theft, and within a year, the Mexican-American War had begun. Their identity, the Lone Star legacy. Texans didn't just see themselves as settlers. They saw themselves as warriors, pioneers, and independent souls, people who could survive against all odds. The Lone Star flag symbolized not just independence from Mexico, but a national identity forged in resistance and self-reliance. Even after joining the U.S., the legend of the Republic lived on. To this day, Texan pride is rooted in those 9 years, a period that gave them stories, heroes, and a sense of uniqueness. Few U.S. states can claim they were once a full-fledged country with foreign embassies and their own military. Texas can, and it does. You'll still see bumper stickers that say, "Secede? We already did." Tartaria, the Empire of Speculation. Tartaria, often referred to as the Empire of Speculation, is one of history's most mysterious and controversial entities. The idea of Tartaria, as a vast and powerful empire stretching across Asia and parts of Eastern Europe, is a topic that remains shrouded in uncertainty, blending historical fact with myth and conspiracy theories. Main activities. The economy of Tartaria is thought to have been based primarily on trade, with its territory covering vast stretches of Asia, from Siberia to the Caspian Sea and into parts of Eastern Europe. It is believed that Tartaria was a hub for the Silk Road, facilitating the exchange of goods like silk, spices, and other luxury items between the East and West. Agriculture, particularly in the fertile regions of Central Asia, would have played a significant role in the economy, with grain and livestock being key commodities. Tartaria was also known for its advanced craftsmanship, including fine textiles and metalwork. The rumors of advanced technologies, such as steam engines and massive cities with infrastructure far beyond what the 17th and 18th centuries should have known, often formed the basis of the more speculative theories surrounding Tartaria. Relationships. Tartaria's relationship with neighboring powers, such as China, the Russian Empire, and Persia, was complex. Some historians suggest that Tartaria was often in a state of conflict with the growing Russian Empire, while others highlight that certain regions within Tartaria, particularly the eastern areas, might have been aligned with or controlled by China at different points in history. On the other hand, the relationship with Persia would have likely been one of trade and occasional political alliances, given the shared interests in maintaining control over Central Asia's valuable resources. The Empire of Tartaria also shares a blurred history with other forgotten states and empires of the time, leading to much speculation about the actual extent of its power and influence. Rise and peak. The rise of Tartaria is believed to have occurred around the 16th century, with its peak coming at a time when it was thought to encompass much of Central Asia, Siberia, and parts of Eastern Europe. Historical records are limited, but Tartaria may have been a loose confederation of tribes and peoples rather than a unified state in the modern sense. Legends tell of powerful leaders, often described as descendants of Genghis Khan or other great conquerors, uniting the region through military conquest and alliances. The size and power of Tartaria seem to peak during this time, with the empire rumored to have had a massive influence on trade routes and military strategies. Decline and fall. Tartaria's decline is often attributed to several factors. The most widely accepted theory is the gradual expansion of the Russian Empire in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Russians pushed eastward, slowly absorbing the territories once thought to be part of Tartaria. This gradual conquest might explain why the Tartarian Empire seemingly disappeared from historical records without much of a clear fall or collapse. The lack of solid documentation and the absence of an identifiable capital or political structure further complicate the history of Tartaria. Other theories suggest that natural disasters, internal divisions, or even a concerted effort by Western powers to erase the memory of Tartaria were involved in its disappearance. What's most interesting is that Tartaria's supposed existence was removed from maps in the 18th century, fueling ideas of deliberate erasure from history. Identity. Tartaria's identity remains one of the most debated aspects of its history. It is said that the empire was a highly advanced civilization, possibly far more so than the European powers of the time. Descriptions from travelers and explorers who may have encountered Tartaria, such as those from Russia and Persia, suggest a highly organized society, with impressive architectural feats, extensive infrastructure, and advanced military technology. Yet, much of what is known about the empire today comes from later accounts, many of which are contradictory, speculative, or distorted. To modern eyes, Tartaria represents a lost, almost mythical empire, one that exists more in the realm of conspiracy theories than in historical fact. Some even suggest that Tartaria's advanced technology and culture were so far ahead of their time that they were erased or hidden from history by the powers that followed. The legacy of Tartaria, though mostly erased, continues to captivate conspiracy theorists and historians alike. Some believe that the empire was a global superpower far beyond anything Europe had known in its time, and that remnants of its technology or culture still lie hidden beneath the sands of Central Asia or deep within old, forgotten archives. For many, Tartaria represents an ancient civilization that was wiped from the record books, not through destruction, but through the deliberate erasure of history itself. Prussia, a once mighty state erased by war. Prussia wasn't just a country, it was an idea, a military machine, and a political force that helped shape modern Europe. From its humble beginnings to its meteoric rise as a dominant German power, and then its erasure after World War II, Prussia's story is one of discipline, ambition, and legacy. Main activities. At its core, Prussia thrived on three pillars: military excellence, bureaucratic efficiency, and economic pragmatism. Its economy was driven by agriculture in the rural eastern provinces, and rapidly industrializing urban centers in the West. Prussia became a hub for iron, coal, and textiles, critical materials that powered both the German unification and its wars. Its administrative model was famously strict, creating one of the most efficient civil services in Europe. But the crown jewel of Prussian life was the military. From childhood, Prussians were taught discipline and loyalty. The army was the state's backbone, well-funded, meticulously organized, and respected across Europe. Relationships: Prussia had a complicated dance with the other great powers. It was often at odds with Austria, its rival for dominance over the German-speaking world. It warred with Denmark, France, and even its own future ally states. But its greatest achievement came when it outmaneuvered Austria and united Germany under its leadership in 1871. That victory put Prussia at the top of the European food chain, but it also sowed the seeds for future conflict. By World War I, Prussia was effectively the beating heart of the German Empire. However, its militaristic image would later be used to scapegoat German aggression after both world wars. Rise and peak. The rise of Prussia began in the 17th century, when the small Duchy of Prussia merged with Brandenburg under the Hohenzollern dynasty. Over time, these rulers expanded their influence through diplomacy, marriage, and war. The real turning point came with Frederick the Great, who transformed Prussia into a military powerhouse in the 18th century. Under his rule, the country's territory expanded, its army crushed stronger opponents, and its global reputation soared. By the time Prussia defeated Austria in the Austro-Prussian War, 1866, and then humiliated France in the Franco-Prussian War, 1870, it stood triumphant. In 1871, with Berlin at its center, Prussia unified the German states into the German Empire, making it the dominant power in Central Europe. Decline and fall. Despite its strength, Prussia's own success led to its undoing. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles stripped it of much of its land and influence, but it still lingered as a concept within the Weimar Republic. Then came Hitler. Although Nazi Germany absorbed and manipulated Prussia's legacy, especially its militarism and order, it also effectively erased it. After World War II, the Allies saw Prussia as a symbol of aggression, authoritarianism, and the wars that had torn Europe apart. In 1947, they officially abolished Prussia as a legal entity. Its lands were carved up, parts went to Poland and the Soviet Union, while others were integrated into new German states. Its institutions were dissolved. Its name was scrubbed from maps. Identity: Prussia saw itself as the defender of order, duty, and progress through discipline. It wasn't a place built on romanticism or grand architecture. It was built on rules, purpose, and cold efficiency. The Prussian soldier became a symbol of professionalism and fearlessness. Others saw Prussia as both a model of organization and a dangerous force of militarism. Today, its legacy is deeply mixed. On one hand, its values of education, efficiency, and meritocracy helped build the modern German state. On the other, its obsession with authority and hierarchy is remembered as a precursor to darker chapters in history. What remains of Prussia today is more spirit than substance. Its borders are gone, but its influence can still be felt in military strategy, public administration, and even school systems across Europe. Gran Colombia, South America's forgotten dream. At the dawn of the 19th century, the winds of revolution were sweeping through the Americas. Colonies were breaking free from empires. And in the north of South America, one man had a vision, not just for independence, but for unity. That man was Simón Bolívar, and the nation he helped create was Gran Colombia. It was bold, ambitious, and for a moment, it looked unstoppable. But the same forces that birthed it would also tear it apart. Main activities: Gran Colombia was born from revolution, but its foundations were agricultural and resource-rich. The fertile valleys of Venezuela and Colombia produced coffee, cocoa, and tobacco, key exports that gave the new nation a strong economic base. Mining, especially for gold and silver, continued from the colonial era. There was also a deep intellectual movement happening. Newspapers, universities, and political discussions were flourishing. The people were building not just a state, but an identity. And because it had such a wide stretch of land, what's now Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Panama, and parts of northern Peru and Brazil, Gran Colombia was strategically vital, with access to both the Caribbean and Pacific, which gave it huge trade potential. But infrastructure was a challenge. Roads were few, communications slow, and regional identities remained stronger than national ones. Relationships. Gran Colombia emerged from war against Spain, but Bolívar envisioned it as a brother to other newly independent nations. He hoped it would become a beacon of liberty, aligning with countries like the United States and other liberated Latin American republics. But diplomacy wasn't easy. Internally, the regions were already struggling to get along. Tensions brewed between federalists, who wanted regional autonomy, and centralists, who backed Bolívar's strong executive model. Externally, European powers watched cautiously, wary of another rising republic in the Americas. Despite Bolívar's hopes, Gran Colombia never became the center of a Latin American alliance. And while it briefly had influence over other liberation movements, it soon found itself focused inward, dealing with fragmentation. Rise and peak. Gran Colombia was officially founded in 1819, after a series of military victories led by Bolívar over the Spanish crown. The key turning point was the Battle of Boyaca, which opened the path to liberate New Granada, modern Colombia. Bolívar was hailed as El Libertador, and by 1821, with the Congress of Cucuta, Gran Colombia was declared a republic, with a constitution and a capital in Bogotá. The vision was massive, a unified, democratic Latin America free from colonial rule. And for a few years, the project surged forward. Bolívar even dreamed of extending Gran Colombia into Peru and Bolivia. He pushed for education, legal reform, and continental unity. On paper, it looked like a republic of the future. Decline and fall, but unity is easier to proclaim than to maintain. The vast size of Gran Colombia worked against it. Travel between cities could take weeks. Regional elites resisted central control, and many felt disconnected from Bogotá's decisions. Bolívar's leadership style, firm and centralized, drew criticism. In 1828, when unrest grew, he declared himself dictator, hoping to preserve the republic through strength. That only made things worse. By 1830, Venezuela and Ecuador had seceded, and Bolívar, heartbroken and disillusioned, resigned and went into exile. That same year, he died in Colombia, feeling that his dream had crumbled. By 1831, Gran Colombia was officially dissolved. It had lasted just 12 years. Identity. Gran Colombia saw itself as the flame of liberty in the New World, a republic built on revolutionary ideals and South American pride. Bolívar envisioned a state where people of different regions and backgrounds could be united by shared purpose and a rejection of colonialism. To others, however, it felt too centralized, too dominated by Bogotá and Bolívar himself. Today, the name, Gran Colombia, is often forgotten, but its legacy lives on in the very idea of Latin American unity. Its former countries still share similar flags, language, and political roots. And Bolívar remains a near-mythical figure, honored in statues, currencies, and street names from Caracas to Quito. Gran Colombia wasn't a failure. It was an idea too big for its time. A dream of one continent, one people, one republic. It burned bright, and then was scattered like ashes across the mountains and coasts it once united. Nubia, a kingdom buried by sands and time. Before the Roman Empire rose, before the pyramids of Giza were built, there was Nubia. An ancient civilization nestled along the Nile in what is now southern Egypt and northern Sudan. Its kingdoms came in waves: Tauseti, Kerma, Napata, Meroe, each rising from the desert like an echo of the one before. Sometimes a rival to Egypt, sometimes its ruler. But always distinct. Always proud. Main activities: Nubia thrived in the heart of Africa's trade routes. It controlled the flow of gold, ivory, ebony, incense, and exotic animals from deeper within the continent. They were also skilled metalworkers, some of the finest in the ancient world. Long before the Iron Age hit Europe, the Nubians were forging weapons and tools from iron in Meroe. Their artisans left behind intricate jewelry, ceramics, and statuary that rivaled anything in the north. Farming along the Nile's fertile banks fed the cities, and the river itself served as the lifeline for both trade and survival. Their craftsmanship was respected, their goods highly sought after. Relationships: Nubia's relationship with Egypt was a mix of admiration, competition, and conquest. At times, Egypt invaded and ruled parts of Nubia, exploiting its gold mines and strategic position. But the reverse also happened. In the 8th century BC, the Kushite kings of Nubia turned the tables. King Pi led a campaign north, conquering Egypt and establishing the 25th dynasty, known as the Black Pharaohs. For nearly a century, Nubian kings ruled all of Egypt from their capital in Napata. But their reign ended when the Assyrians invaded from the east. Still, that era carved Nubia into the history of Egyptian greatness. Beyond Egypt, Nubia traded with sub-Saharan cultures, with the Red Sea world, and even the Greco-Roman empires in its later days. Rise and peak: the first major Nubian kingdom, Kerma, rose around 2500 BC, known for its powerful warriors and complex society. After Egypt's Middle Kingdom collapsed, Kerma even expanded into Egyptian territory. Then came Napata, when Nubia grew into a spiritual powerhouse, embracing and adapting Egyptian gods, temples, and hieroglyphs into their own style. But the peak came with Meroe. Starting around 300 BC, it became a metropolis: iron smelting, pyramids with steep angles, a writing system of its own, and powerful kandakes, queens who ruled as equals or superiors to kings. That's right, Nubia had warrior queens long before the term went viral. Their empire stretched deep into Africa's interior, rooted in tradition but open to innovation. Decline and fall: several forces eroded Nubia's strength. First came the shifting of trade routes. Caravans and sea traders bypassed the old Nile paths. Then the Romans, after annexing Egypt, clashed with Nubian armies. While Meroe held its ground for a while, pressure from northern and southern invaders grew. Climate change also played a role. Desertification crept in, making agriculture harder. Over centuries, political fragmentation and economic decline wore down the kingdom. By around 350 CE, the kingdom of Aksum, in modern Ethiopia, invaded and dealt the final blow. Meroe was abandoned. Its temples fell silent. And Nubia's once golden legacy was left to be buried in sand. Identity: Nubians saw themselves as rightful heirs of the Nile, a people of kings, gods, and deep cultural pride. Even when they borrowed from Egypt, they reinterpreted it with their own soul. Their art, their pyramids, their language, Meroitic script, all speak to a people who refuse to be mere copies. And while later empires erased or absorbed much of Nubia's history, their legacy remains in the Sudanese pyramids, over 200 still standing today, more than Egypt itself. Their spirit also lives on in the stories of resistance, of queens who led armies, of black pharaohs who dreamed big. The Kingdom of Hawaii, sovereign before statehood. Long before it became the 50th star on the U.S. flag, Hawaii was an independent nation. Not just scattered islands with local chiefs, but a unified kingdom, with its own monarchs, constitution, flag, and diplomatic recognition from global empires. It rose through blood, strategy, and cultural power. And what followed was a tragic dismantling of that sovereignty, piece by piece, in full view of the world. Main activities: the Kingdom of Hawaii thrived on agriculture, trade, and seafaring. The land produced sugarcane, taro, sweet potatoes, coconuts, and later, vast sugar and pineapple plantations that would dominate the economy. Hawaiians were skilled in canoe navigation and long-distance ocean travel, long before modern instruments existed. They also developed fish pond aquaculture, a highly advanced and sustainable method of managing coastal fisheries. In the 19th century, Hawaii's harbors became strategic trade hubs for whalers, merchants, and missionaries between America, Asia, and the Pacific. It was more than paradise, it was prime real estate for empire builders. Relationships: Hawaii balanced a complex game with the world's powers. At its peak, the kingdom was recognized by the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and other nations. Treaties were signed. Embassies were established. The Hawaiian monarchs sent diplomats abroad, studied foreign systems, and invited experts in law, medicine, and governance. But with this openness came influence. American missionaries and businessmen slowly gained economic and political control, especially over sugar exports. Meanwhile, the British and French occasionally flexed their naval power to assert themselves. The kingdom was walking a tightrope between independence and foreign dependence. Rise and peak. The kingdom began with one man, King Kamehameha I, who in 1810 unified the islands through diplomacy and military conquest. Known as the Napoleon of the Pacific, Kamehameha established a centralized monarchy with a legal system and respect for Hawaiian traditions. His successors continued to modernize. By the mid-1800s, under rulers like King Kamehameha III and King Kalakaua, Hawaii had a written constitution, schools, hospitals, a royal palace, and even a national anthem. King Kalakaua, a visionary, embraced both tradition and progress, reviving hula and native practices while also electrifying Iolani Palace, before even the White House had electricity. Hawaii stood as a small but respected kingdom with cultural pride and international recognition. Decline and fall. The fall didn't come from war, it came from politics, manipulation, and economic takeover. In 1887, American businessmen and sugar planters forced King Kalakaua to sign the Bayonet Constitution, stripping the monarchy of most power and giving voting rights to foreign landowners. When his sister, Queen Liliuokalani, took the throne in 1891, she tried to restore royal authority. Her pushback was met with a coup. In 1893, a group of U.S.-backed businessmen and settlers, with support from the U.S. Marines, overthrew the Queen and established a provisional government. Despite petitions from native Hawaiians and international outrage, the United States annexed Hawaii in 1898. The kingdom, sovereign and recognized for nearly a century, was erased, turned into a U.S. territory, and eventually a state in 1959. Identity. The Hawaiian kingdom was deeply rooted in mana, a spiritual energy tied to land, ancestry, and leadership. The monarchs saw themselves not as rulers above the people, but as stewards of the land and culture. Hawaiian society had a deep respect for ina, land, ohana, family, and the balance between tradition and innovation. Even today, many native Hawaiians do not consider the U.S. annexation legal. The flag of the kingdom still flies in protests. The royal genealogy is preserved. And the memory of the kingdom, of sovereign Hawaii, is being reclaimed, one story at a time. Desa, now just a car brand, once a land of gold and resistance. Tucked between the Carpathian Mountains and the Danube River, where modern-day Romania and Moldova now lie, existed a fierce and proud kingdom called Desa. Long before Rome ever set its sights on it, Desa had already built a legacy of warrior kings, skilled metalwork, and massive fortresses hidden in the hills. From the outside, it looked like a distant borderland, but for the Romans, it was the golden frontier. And they meant that literally. Their main activities: gold, craftsmanship, and fortresses. Desa was loaded. The Apusini Mountains were packed with rich gold deposits. Dacians weren't just miners, they were expert metalworkers, producing intricate jewelry, armor, and tools that rivaled anything in the ancient world. Some of their craftsmanship still stuns archaeologists today. Agriculture kept the people fed, grains, sheep, cattle, but it was the gold and salt that made them powerful. These weren't isolated mountain folk. They traded with Greeks, Scythians, Celts, and Thracians, blending influences while staying fiercely independent. Their architecture was no joke either. In the mountains of Oresti, they built a network of stone citadels and sanctuaries, like the fortress of Sarmizegetusa Regia, a mix of ritual site and military stronghold. This was no backwater, it was a real civilization. Relationships, enemies at the gate. Desa's biggest relationship, if you could call it that, was with Rome. And it was bloody. By the 1st century CE, Rome saw Desa as a threat and a prize. The Dacians, especially under King Decebalus, had unified various tribes and become strong, organized, and defiant. Multiple Roman emperors tried and failed to conquer them. Even Domitian paid them off just to keep the peace. But the tension hit a boiling point under Emperor Trajan, who launched a full-scale war around 101 to 106 CE. It wasn't just about dominance. It was about gold. Rome's economy was struggling, and Dacia's riches could fund Rome's empire for years. The wars were brutal, with mountains turned to battlegrounds, and both sides suffering heavy losses. Their rise and peak, Decebalus and the dream of a united Dacia. For centuries, Dacia had been a land of scattered tribes, sometimes united, more often divided. But around the 1st century BC, a powerful ruler named Birbista brought many of the tribes together into a centralized kingdom. He built fortresses, expelled foreign influences, and even tangled with Julius Caesar through alliances and rivalries. Later, under Decebalus, Dacia reached its peak. He was a strategic genius, using the mountain terrain, diplomacy, and psychological warfare to keep Rome at bay. He won early victories, manipulated peace deals, and became a symbol of resistance. At its height, Dacia controlled vast areas from the Black Sea to the heart of Central Europe. It was more than just survival. It was rising power in its own right. Their decline or fall, when empires want what you have. The fall came not from within, but from relentless Roman pressure. Trajan's second campaign was a military machine. He built massive roads and bridges just to reach Dacia's heartland. The siege of Sarmizegetusa was the final blow. Fortresses were destroyed, the Dacian elite killed or enslaved, and Decebalus, refusing capture, took his own life. In 106 CE, Dacia became a Roman province. But this wasn't assimilation, it was erasure. Thousands of Dacians were displaced, Roman settlers poured in, and the native culture was suppressed under imperial rule. Trajan built a monument to his victory, Trajan's Column in Rome, a giant scroll of stone that shows the war in vivid detail. It's stunning and chilling. Their identity, from warriors to ghosts in stone. Dacians saw themselves as noble, strong, and spiritually connected to the land. Their religion, tied to the god Zalmoxis, was deep, complex, and unique, mixing ancestor worship, astrology, and mysticism. They believed the soul was immortal and that death was a transition, not an end. That made them fearless in battle. Even their enemies, like the Romans, respected them. You can see it in how Roman art depicts the Dacians, bearded, proud, and dignified, not caricatures. That's rare. Today, Dacia is mostly remembered through ruins, museum pieces, and ironically, a car brand. But under that steel badge is a name that once stood for a whole nation of mountain warriors, artisans, and a culture that refused to be forgotten. Some Romanians today still see themselves as descendants of the Dacians, a lost people whose spirit never fully died. Boom! Dacia brought back from the shadows, just like you wanted. Yugoslavia, a land of unity, broken apart. Yugoslavia, a name that once symbolized unity in a region of deep historical and ethnic complexities, was born out of the ashes of World War I. Created in 1918, after the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was meant to bring together the South Slavic people, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and others, into one nation. The idea was to forge a strong, united identity in a region historically divided by centuries of empires, ethnic conflicts, and religious differences. At first, Yugoslavia was more of a dream than a reality. The kingdom that emerged was a mix of various peoples, languages, and faiths: Orthodox Serbs, Catholic Croats, Muslim Bosniaks, and others all living within the same borders. But for decades, the nation struggled with a balance of power, as these different groups jostled for influence in a state that never fully felt like home to all of them. However, the idea of a unified South Slavic identity started to take shape more clearly under the leadership of Josip Broz Tito, the communist revolutionary who led the partisan resistance against Nazi occupation during World War II. When Tito became the leader of post-war Yugoslavia, he worked hard to suppress the ethnic tensions that had plagued the country for centuries. Tito's leadership became a symbol of national unity, and for a time, Yugoslavia seemed to defy history. But Tito's death in 1980 marked the beginning of Yugoslavia's slow, painful unraveling. Under Tito, the country had been held together by a strong, centralized government that balanced the competing ethnic and political interests. But once he was gone, those tensions, simmering beneath the surface, began to rise again. Economic struggles, corruption, and rising nationalism set the stage for the eventual breakup of the country. Main activities: economy, industry, and trade. Yugoslavia was an industrialized socialist state with a unique economic model. Unlike most Eastern Bloc countries, it wasn't fully controlled by the Soviet Union. Instead, it operated on a system of self-management, where workers had a say in the running of factories and enterprises. This system allowed Yugoslavia to maintain a relatively strong industrial base, with key sectors like mining, automotive production, and agriculture contributing to its economy. Yugoslavia also played a key role in the global stage, as a member of the non-aligned movement, which positioned it as an important player in the Cold War. Trade routes connected the country to both the East and the West, and Yugoslavia was often seen as a bridge between the two superpowers, fostering relationships with both the Soviet Union and the United States. Relationships, internal struggles, and international influence. Internally, Yugoslavia was a patchwork of rival ethnic groups. The Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes had historically been at odds with one another, and Tito's centralized rule could only keep these tensions under control for so long. Nationalism began to resurface in the 1980s, with different republics and ethnic groups demanding greater autonomy. Externally, Yugoslavia maintained a position of non-alignment, trying to stay out of the superpower rivalry during the Cold War. But after Tito's death, the Soviet Union's influence began to fade, and Yugoslavia's leaders struggled to navigate the changing global dynamics. The tension within the country reached its breaking point in the early 1990s, when the republics of Slovenia and Croatia declared their independence. What followed was a brutal series of wars that would tear the country apart, with ethnic and religious divisions leading to some of the most horrific violence Europe had seen since World War II. Rise and peak, a unified Yugoslavia. The rise of Yugoslavia was marked by a period of unity, despite the deep differences between its peoples. Under Tito, the country experienced economic growth, industrial development, and relative social stability. It was a time when people from different ethnic groups lived side by side, and the idea of a unified South Slavic state seemed possible. Tito was a strong leader who emphasized brotherhood and unity, and he worked to suppress the nationalist movements that threatened to pull the country apart. By the 1970s, Yugoslavia had become one of the most developed socialist nations in Europe, and it was seen as an example of how ethnic diversity could be managed in a communist state. The country was a popular tourist destination, with visitors flocking to its Adriatic coast and cultural centers. Decline or fall, nationalism, war, and the end of Yugoslavia. However, the death of Tito in 1980 left a power vacuum, and by the late 1980s, the situation began to deteriorate rapidly. Nationalist movements in Croatia, Serbia, and Slovenia began to gain momentum. As the republics demanded greater independence, Serbia, under the leadership of Slobodan Milosevic, began to take a more aggressive stance, seeking to maintain a centralized, Serb-dominated Yugoslavia. The conflict exploded in 1991 when Slovenia and Croatia declared independence, triggering the Yugoslav Wars, a violent series of ethnic conflicts that would last through the 1990s. Thousands were killed, and millions were displaced. The international community responded with sanctions and interventions, but the Yugoslav Federation dissolved into separate states, leaving behind a region scarred by war and trauma. Identity, a lost dream of unity. For many people, Yugoslavia represented the ideal of unity, a dream that was ultimately shattered by nationalist fervor and ethnic strife. During Tito's reign, Yugoslavia was proud of its diversity, and the country's motto, brotherhood and unity, was a symbol of the hope that different ethnic groups could coexist peacefully. Yet, in the end, identity became something deeply contested. What it meant to be Yugoslav vanished as the republics redefined themselves along national and ethnic lines. Even today, the legacy of Yugoslavia is complex. Some long for the days when the country seemed unified, while others see its collapse as the natural consequence of ethnic divisions and the rise of nationalism. Sikkim, a Himalayan kingdom now part of India. Imagine a small but proud kingdom nestled between giants, India, China, Nepal, and Bhutan, a land of snow-capped peaks, Buddhist monasteries, and a monarchy that lasted for over 300 years. That was Sikkim, a country of its own until 1975. Today, it's a state in India. But not long ago, it had borders, alliances, enemies, and a whole story that deserves to be remembered. Main activities: trade, spiritual culture, and self-sufficiency. Sikkim's rugged terrain made large-scale agriculture tricky, but they adapted. Terraced farming, yak herding, and cardamom plantations, Sikkim became one of the world's top producers, kept the economy moving. But Sikkim's biggest strength wasn't what it grew, it was where it sat. It was a gateway. Lying along ancient trade routes connecting India and Tibet, Sikkim became a passage for Buddhist pilgrims, traders, and diplomats. They moved salt, wool, and gold across these treacherous paths, with Sikkim's mountain passes becoming lifelines of exchange. But Sikkim wasn't just about trade, it was about faith. A deeply spiritual Buddhist kingdom, Sikkim invested in monasteries, schools of learning, and cultural preservation. The influence of Tibetan Buddhism ran deep, but Sikkim had its own flavor, fusing indigenous Lepcha traditions with Himalayan spirituality. Relationships, sandwiched between giants. Sikkim had to be smart. It wasn't just about borders, it was about survival between powerhouses. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Nepal invaded multiple times, seizing territory. Bhutan, too, clashed with Sikkim over control of mountain passes. When the British East India Company arrived in nearby India, Sikkim aligned with them for protection, and the British returned the favor by helping push back Nepalese forces. But the partnership came at a cost. Slowly, Sikkim became more dependent on British India. Treaties restricted its autonomy, and by the early 20th century, it became a British protectorate, not colonized, but no longer fully free. After India's independence in 1947, Sikkim retained its status as a sovereign kingdom under Indian suzerainty, meaning it handled its internal affairs, while India managed defense, communication, and diplomacy. Still, that independence stood, for a while. Rise and peak, the Namgyal dynasty and cultural flourishing. Sikkim was unified in 1642 under the Namgyal dynasty, with Phuntsog Namgyal crowned as its first Chogyal king. The Chogyals claimed divine Buddhist authority and led the kingdom for over 3 centuries. During its golden era, Sikkim was peaceful, culturally rich, and respected by its neighbors for its spiritual depth and diplomatic balance. Its capital, Gangtok, grew into a center of learning and cultural fusion. Tibetan, Lepcha, Buddhist, and later, Nepali communities all coexisted under a relatively stable royal court. The 1950s and 60s were tense but pivotal. With China taking over Tibet and the region getting hotter politically, Sikkim's location became strategic. India fortified its influence, but the monarchy tried to hold on to independence. Fall and decline, democracy, dissent, and annexation. The Chogyals' rule started to weaken in the 1970s, especially as the ethnic Nepali population, by then the majority in Sikkim, demanded more democratic representation. The monarchy was seen by many as too aligned with traditional elites and out of step with the times. Tensions boiled in 1973, when protests erupted over election manipulation. India stepped in, ostensibly to restore order, and stationed troops in Sikkim. Political change accelerated fast. In 1975, after a controversial referendum, Sikkim voted to abolish the monarchy and join India as its 22nd state. But many questions remain. How fair was the vote? Was it orchestrated? Did the people truly want annexation, or was it the will of outside powers? The answers still divide opinions. Identity, more than a footnote in a federation. Sikkimese identity is multilayered. The Lepchas, the Budhas, the Tibetans, and the Nepali communities all shaped what Sikkim was and still is. It's not a simple case of a small country swallowed by a giant, it's a kingdom whose spirit survives through its culture, language, and memory. Even today, some older Sikkimese remember the monarchy with affection. The last king, Palden Thondup Namgyal, lived in quiet exile, never fully accepting the loss of his throne. Sikkim still looks and feels different from much of India. Prayer flags flutter over misty ridges, monasteries ring bells at dawn, and the echoes of a once sovereign mountain kingdom linger in every village and pass. Quiet Reflections: How History Forgets. History, my G, has a strange way of dealing with the past. Some countries and cultures burn brightly for a time, only to fade into obscurity, sometimes so gradually that no one even notices. Whether it's a slow erosion of power, the ravages of war, or the quiet dissolution of an empire, the stories of forgotten borders often go untold. But these places didn't just vanish. They lived, they thrived, they faced struggles, and they left marks on the world. Just because they're no longer on maps doesn't mean they didn't shape the cultures and nations we know today. Take Prussia, for example, one of the most influential powers in European history, reduced to a few lines on a history book. Or Yugoslavia, a land that represented unity for so many, only to be broken apart by internal conflict. Tartaria existed in the imaginations of Europeans for centuries, yet its true history remains a puzzle. What about the Republic of Texas? A state that once stood as its own sovereign nation before joining the United States, leaving behind its unique culture and sense of independence. Or the Kingdom of Hawaii, once a sovereign monarchy before it became part of a larger empire. These are more than footnotes in history. They are reminders of how fragile nations are, how even the greatest empires can be eclipsed by time and circumstance. And as new countries rise, old ones disappear, sometimes without a whisper. Conclusion: where do countries go when they're gone? So where do countries go when they're gone, my G? What happens when borders shift, empires fall, and nations fade from memory? It's a question that echoes throughout history. Some vanish entirely, like Nubia, whose legacy now lives only in the sands of time. Others leave behind fragments of culture, stories, and artifacts, like Grand Colombia or the Kingdom of Sikkim, whose people's identities still linger in the present. The true answer? Maybe they don't go anywhere. They live on in memories, in the stories we tell, and in the lessons we can still learn from their rise and fall. History may forget the borders, but the echoes of what those countries were, the people they nurtured, and the power they wielded continue to shape the world today. These forgotten countries remind us that nothing lasts forever, not even the mightiest empires. They may not exist anymore on maps, but they will always remain part of the fabric of history, woven into the stories of those who came after them.